It all started when Brian became quieter than usual. He would sit in the corner of the living room and watch Peter talk, joke, make decisions, lead the family. Peter was always the one in charge. That was normal. But Brian had never really noticed it the way he did now. Every time Peter spoke over him, Brian's ears twitched. Every time Peter announced what everyone would do, Brian's jaw tightened. At first it was just irritation, but then something inside him began to spiral. He stopped sleeping properly. At night he wandered the house, whispering to himself, "I could be in charge. I could lead. I could be the one they listen to." Lois overheard him once in the bathroom, staring at himself in the mirror and muttering, "Why not me? Why never me?" By the third day, his fur had changed, standing up in jagged clumps as if constantly electrified. He looked larger, too. His eyes were darker, deeper. His claws scraped the wooden floor loudly now, even when he tried to walk slowly. When the family asked what was going on, he answered with a strange, calm clarity, a voice too steady to be his. "I'm finally realizing my potential." And he stared at all of them without blinking. One night, Lois woke up to a silence that didn't feel right. She reached beside her. Peter wasn't in the bed. She walked into the living room and froze. Brian was sitting in Peter's recliner, perfectly straight, perfectly confident. He turned to her and said, "He's not the head of the family anymore." Lois demanded to know where Peter was, but Brian only lifted his lips slightly, revealing sharp teeth he didn't have before. The next day, Brian began giving orders, where Lois should clean, what Meg should do, what Chris should turn on or off. His voice had a cold authority that made everyone hesitate. The house grew dimmer. Lights flickered constantly. At night, the sound of Brian's footsteps echoed through the hallway, heavy, almost too heavy, like something large was pacing the house. Stewie was the first to piece it together. He'd noticed that Brian frequently came up from the basement, quietly, as if making sure no one followed him. One afternoon, when Brian stepped away to the kitchen, Stewie slipped downstairs. In the far corner, he found Peter, bruised, exhausted, barely conscious. When he saw Stewie, he whispered, "He wants to be in charge. He took everything. He won't let me out." But before Stewie could respond, footsteps began descending the basement stairs, slow, deliberate, powerful. Brian appeared in the doorway, much larger than before, fur spiked in all directions, eyes glowing faintly with a yellowish light. He looked at Stewie, then at Peter, and said quietly, "I'm the head of the family now, and you both stay here." The basement door slammed shut. The lock clicked, and the house returned to silence. The final scene was simple and wrong. The camera slowly panned across the living room. Lois, Meg, and Chris sat perfectly still, as if waiting for instructions. And in Peter's recliner sat Brian, calm, composed, breathing like a creature finally satisfied with its place. He didn't look at the camera. He didn't need to. He had already won. The episode cut to black. It all started when Brian became just a little quieter than usual. He stopped cracking jokes, barely argued with Stewie, and didn't complain about anything. At first, the family thought he was just tired, but within a couple of days, they noticed Brian's breathing had changed. Deep, slow, almost like something inside him was shifting. Peter joked it was allergies, but Lois was the first to see the muscles on Brian's back twitch, as if something under his fur was growing. That night, Brian paced around the house for hours, and every step he took sounded heavier, like he'd somehow become bigger. When Peter turned on the lights, Brian slipped into the shadows as if trying to hide. And the next morning, everyone noticed he actually was taller. Not by much, but enough to make everyone uncomfortable. On the third day, Meg disappeared. Peter walked through the whole house calling her name, but there was no answer. Brian just sat in the kitchen corner, staring at Peter without blinking, as if he knew more than he wanted to admit. Peter asked, "Brian, did you see where Meg went?" Brian slowly turned his head away. On the fourth day, Chris vanished too. His door was open, his bed messy, and his window lifted just slightly. When Peter approached Brian again, the dog didn't even look up. He just let out a long, deep breath. And in that moment, Peter thought Brian's shoulders looked broader, his claws just a little longer than before. On the fifth day, Lois never came down for breakfast. Peter searched every room in panic, calling her name, checking closets, looking outside. Nothing. The house felt too still, too empty, like something underneath it was breathing. He rushed to Brian, yelling, "Where's Lois? What's happening? Why won't you say anything?" But Brian only lifted his eyes that had grown too dark, too deep, reflecting something feral and enormous. By now, Brian took up almost half the kitchen. His chest rose and fell like a massive beast's, and his neck and shoulders were far too large for a normal dog. That night, Peter woke up to heavy footsteps moving slowly through the hallway. He stepped outside his room and saw a massive shadow passing the living room doorway. The shape was vaguely Brian-like, but far taller, almost reaching the ceiling. Peter wanted to call out, but in that moment he realized he was completely alone. Everyone else was gone, and every time he asked Brian about the missing family members, Brian simply stayed silent. On the final night, Peter gathered his courage and approached the living room. Brian was there, fully transformed now, enormous, broad, monstrous, his body rising and falling with slow, thunderous breaths. He sat in the center of the room, staring into the darkness like he was listening to something only he could hear. Peter stood a few feet away and whispered, "Brian, do you understand what you've done?" Brian slowly turned his head, looking straight at Peter with a gaze that had none of the old Brian left in it. The lights flickered. For a split second, the room was swallowed by darkness, and when the lamps came back on, Peter was gone. The house was silent again. Only Brian remained, massive, motionless, staring into the empty living room. And that's where the episode cut to black. At first, everything in the Griffin house seemed completely normal. Brian was sitting in the kitchen with the family, lazily chewing on leftovers and cracking a few jokes like he always did. But later that evening, he found some old container in the trash, something Peter had tossed out days ago, and without thinking twice, Brian licked it clean. Nobody paid attention to it at the time, but that's when the strange things started happening. The next day, Brian became unusually quiet. He barely spoke, didn't bark, didn't complain, and spent most of the day lying under the table, almost as if he was avoiding the light. Lois thought he just ate something bad and gave him some medicine, but it didn't help. That night, Brian kept waking up and pacing around the house in circles, making a low, restless growl that didn't sound like him at all. On the third day, the family noticed something odd about Brian's expression. His eyes had a heavier, focused look, like he was constantly thinking about something they couldn't understand. When Peter tried to scratch behind his ear, Brian jerked back sharply, staring at the wall behind Peter, as if he heard something no one else could. And then the physical changes started. Very subtle at first. Brian seemed just a tiny bit bigger in the morning, then a little bigger that evening. And by the end of the day, he looked noticeably larger than before. Even his teeth began to change. His once normal dog teeth were growing into long, sharp fangs, though Brian acted like he didn't even notice. On the fourth night, Brian began leaving the house. Each morning, the front door would be slightly open, and Brian would come back covered in dirt and carrying the smell of cold forest air, even though the nearest forest was nowhere near their neighborhood. The family grew worried, but nobody knew what to do. Peter tried putting him on a leash, but Brian just stared at it so long and so intensely that Peter felt uncomfortable and ended up taking it off himself. On the fifth day, Brian stopped responding to his name entirely. He just sat by the window, staring into the darkness as if someone out there was calling him. Stewie tried talking to him, But Brian replied with a deep, steady growl that didn't sound like him at all. It sounded like it belonged to a much bigger dog. That night, the house filled with heavy footsteps, even though nobody was walking. Lois woke up first and heard something slowly coming down the stairs. When she peeked into the hallway, she saw only a large dog-like shadow moving across the wall. She told herself it was just her imagination and went back to bed. By morning, Peter and Lois were gone. Their phones were left on the living room table. Their bedroom door was open, but they were nowhere in the house. Chris and Meg were missing too. No signs of a struggle, no sounds, nothing. The whole place felt unnaturally silent, like every living thing had simply disappeared. The only thing left was Brian's collar, lying in the middle of the living room floor. That evening, the TV turned on by itself. The screen showed the sidewalk outside their house. The camera shook a little, but for a moment you could clearly see a giant dog-shaped figure standing in the distance. It looked like Brian, or like something that used to be Brian, only much larger. It paused as if realizing it was being watched and slowly turned its head toward the house. The screen cut to black. Since then, the Griffin house has stayed empty. But neighbors say that sometimes, late at night, they hear heavy footsteps outside and a low, familiar growl echoing down the street. And nobody is brave enough to look out the window